Okay. So the original title was the relationship between how fisheries are managed and outcomes. I'm going to concentrate, talk about that a bit, but in fact I'm going to talk mostly about various aspects of fisheries management, because I think it's often people tend to lose sight of some of the important parts of it. So first, got to remember that there are many objectives associated with fisheries. And actually, I realize I should add one more here, which would be ecosystem effects. Okay. So, basically, fisheries are about harvest, producing food, producing the money that comes from it. But another dimension, and so one of the dimensions is, well, what's the biological status of the fishery? Another is profitability. So you can have fisheries that are doing very well biologically, but may not be doing well economically. We also want to generate employment. And in many countries, that's a major objective of the fisheries policy. In other countries, it's very explicitly not. Another is maintaining fisheries-dependent communities. Again, in some countries, that's a very high priority. For many years, Canada treated fishery in eastern Canada as a welfare system. In fact, also in the West, that the fishery was the welfare system. And then there's obviously a lot of concern about the ecosystem effects of fishing, and we would in general like to do all of those four things above and not really impact the ecosystem. So I want to start off with just think about fisheries management and how do we manage the abundance of the fish. So I've got a series of questions now. One, what specific actions do we take to manage the abundance of the fish and both in Iceland and those of you from other countries, what do your management agencies actually do? Okay, so what do you actually do that affects how many fish are in the sea? Okay, so landing quotas. Okay, I'll just put that under TACs. And so that's a major management action Iceland presumably does as well. That's one way of managing abundance of fish. What other ways? Anyone? Yes? Okay. That's okay. Closed periods for the Hilsha fishery, and that's very common in a lot of Asia. What other actions do? Okay, yeah. Okay. Gear restrictions of various kinds. I'll just lump in there not only the kinds of fishing gear, but almost every place I know of has mesh size regulations and things like that. Yeah. So, I'll just say closed areas in general. Almost every place I know has some closed areas, either spawning or juvenile areas or sensitive habitats. All of those affect the abundance of fish and how much fish we take out. Any other major? Okay, there are some places that do effort or days at sea. So one of the most the most valuable fishery in the United States is Atlantic sea scallops, and that is not regulated by quota. It's regulated by days at sea and vessel restrictions. So they basically okay. So these are all specific management actions that can be taken with respect to managing the fish. Now, what kind of actions do we do that affect the profitability? Okay, come on, Iceland. It's an obvious answer here. Sorry? Well, the management agencies don't do that, right? As in TAC or... Come on, what am I? Where's it? Well, in the industrial side, okay, the ITQ system, right? The one of the major purposes of the ITQ system was to make fishing more profitable, right? And certainly in my experience in Iceland, Canada, the U.S., it's been very successful at that. Okay. Yes. ITQ stands for Individual Transferable Quota. So what that means is that rather than there being a total quota and what is usually called the Olympic system, and everybody goes out and catches fish as fast as they can until the quota is used up, each vessel knows how much it can catch. And what has almost always happened under ITQ systems is the total amount of fishing effort goes down, many boats retire, and you have a smaller fleet that is much more profitable. And I know that in Iceland and in New Zealand, that the profitability has become a social concern. That what do you call them here? Quota barons or some quota kings? And the same things happen in the U.S. And fisheries have become very profitable, which is exactly what was supposed to happen. But it's there can be too much of a good thing. At least in some eyes. Okay, anything else that is done? Yes? Very good point. Okay, so how does, let's go through, how does certification affect profitability? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one of the major motivations for certification is to get a higher price in the marketplace for certified as opposed to, or access to markets. So, in general, it's very difficult to sell fish to a major retailer in Germany unless you have one of very few certification systems. Anything else that... okay. Both positively and negatively, right? Well, you see, in the U.S., vertical integration in many fisheries is not allowed. So, yeah. Okay. Right. And that's so they can be regulating, either allowing it or not allowing. Okay. Anything else? Yes. Ah, okay. Okay. Okay, okay. I think there's a big one that is being missed. What? Exactly, subsidies. So certainly, historically, many countries subsidize various aspects of fishing to maintain its profitability. Japan, for many years, provided fuel subsidies to its long-distance tuna fleet. They could, and as soon as those subsidies were eliminated, the Japanese long-distance tuna fleet shrank about 70%. Okay, so the point is that fisheries management is a lot more than just regulating the catch. We do a whole bunch of things. Yes? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that as we manage the fish, we can affect the profitability. And one of the things we've seen in a lot of fisheries is as we've reduced fishing mortality rate and as stocks have built up, we've seen higher CPUE, which means the cost of fishing goes down. We have both less fishing mortality, but we get the catch faster, and that makes the fishing more profitable. Okay, that's now, what do we do to manage employment? So, does Iceland have any fishing policy objectives with respect to employment? Okay. 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 That's very I'd say very common in Alaska. A certain portion of the quotas are allocated to communities, which I think that would be probably very similar. I mean, subsidies also overlap here a lot because a lot of subsidies are there in order to maintain the employment in fisheries. I mean, Canada had a bizarre, it had a system where you had to work, I can't even remember the numbers now, but let's say you had to work 50 days at a job in a year, and then you could go on unemployment. Okay, so in many communities in eastern Canada, there were two crews. One would work 50 days, and they would go on unemployment, and another crew would work 50 days. So you really only had 100 jobs, but you could keep 300 people employed in a combination between getting these 50 days in and the unemployment system subsidies. Any? Mm-hmm. Okay. How about from some of the fellows here? Are there things that your governments do to try to maintain employment? Okay. Well, but think about that. I mean, I think I'll skip past the next thing. I think maintaining fisheries-dependent communities and employment are pretty closely related. But actually, I'm gonna go back here because this isn't just good things. This is bad things in some sense. I mean, in general, ITQs have reduced the employment in the fishery. I'll do another one. Buybacks. Oops. Are you familiar with the concept of the buyback? So that's a term that we use where the government says we have too many fishing vessels, and they go in and they just purchase some of those vessels and take them out of production. And that has an impact on employment. Okay. Hmm. Oh, wait. I got another one just thought of. Um, so again, Japan, China, the United States do a lot of stock enhancement. That is releasing typically hatchery-reared fish into the marine fisheries in order to increase the catch. And employment is very often a big part of that. I mean, Japan, I think, very significant portion of Japanese coastal fisheries are coming from enhanced stocks. Some of our salmon fisheries are pretty dependent upon enhancement. So, and that's actually another form of subsidy, typically depending upon who's paying for it. All right. So we need to think about the fishery. This is a figure from, I think Dorothy Dunkel put this together, but taken from a diagram that Tony Charles put together, that a fishery is what we often call a coupled natural human system. And it's got three parts. You've got a natural ecosystem, that is the fish, their predators, their prey, their competitors. You've got human system, that is the fishermen, the community, the processing value chain, and you've got a management system. I mean, you can't have a fishery without these two parts. If you don't have anyone catching the fish, it's not a fishery, right? You can have a natural ecosystem, but to be a fishery, and most fisheries have management systems, but not all. And so there's a bunch of elements of a fishery. There's a population, there's an ecosystem, there's a physical environment, there's harvesting fleets, there's commercial, recreational, there's fishing communities, there's processing and markets, and there's a management framework that has legal structure, data collection and research, regulatory structure, funding, monitoring, compliance, and surveillance. And these are all part of fisheries management. And again, we tend to, certainly people like me who've come from a sort of a harvest regulation, stock assessment perspective, we tend to forget about a lot of this stuff and think that fisheries management is harvest regulation. But fisheries management is much more than harvest regulation. I think that's really did that one. It's the same slide over and over again. Okay, now, again, when you get to the management system, it's pretty complicated. You know, in the United States, we have 6 or 7 major pieces of legislation that affect how we manage our fisheries. And again, I don't know the Icelandic situation. I know that's also true in Canada. It's true in New Zealand. So we have a primary Fisheries Management Act called the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Management and Conservation Act that is sort of was really built to describe the management system. But we also have a thing called the Marine Mammal Protection Act, not something likely to be passed in Iceland, that basically says marine mammals are sacred, don't do anything that would hurt a marine mammal, more or less. Not completely. We actually have got permission on occasion to shoot some marine mammals if they're eating another endangered species. And it greatly constrains the fisheries management options in some cases. We have the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act mostly impacts freshwater circumstances. Then we have an Endangered Species Act. That again has a big impact in many cases on our fisheries management. And then we have another thing called the National Environmental Policy Act. All of those things interact with the fisheries management system. Then you have international agreements. Now, Law of the Sea, the U.S. isn't burdened with that. It hasn't signed the Law of the Sea. But there's a straddling stocks agreement, UN Code of Conduct for Responsible Fishing. And many countries are tied into those. So you have a very complex set of regulations that affect how you can manage the fishery. And then the management system has a whole bunch of elements. Data collection and research, these are all kinds of things that might be studied. And you have regulatory structure. Again, this one, access, who can fish, that is in many ways more fundamental to the fisheries management system than the harvest regulation. Certainly is, I would say, is just as important. Now, many countries don't regulate that at all, and in some, even in the United States, we still have some fisheries that are open access, that anyone who wants to go fishing can go out and do that. They might have to pay $100 for a permit, but the history of fisheries management in most of the developed world has been moving from open access to the next step is commonly what we call limited entry. That is, there's only a certain number of boats that are allowed to fish, and then you can move from limited entry to various ways to, as Iceland and New Zealand did, ITQs, or you can move to allocating fish to communities. There's lots of ways you can further restrict access. What's the most important fish access agreement that has affected fisheries the most? Exactly. Moving from the territorial sea to the 200-mile zone. Iceland was one of the first to declare a 200-mile zone. Was it? Did you actually declare a 200-mile zone originally, or I can't remember when you preceded the law of the sea, right? And actually, there's a very interesting story about that. Question is, why 200 miles? Does anyone know? Well, the story, as I've been told, and that's a good story even if it's not true, had to do with tuna. And Ecuador wanted to keep foreign boats from fishing in its waters, and so it sent, well, foreign boats meaning mostly American boats, so it sent the Americans a proposal for where it wanted to have its exclusive access to fisheries. And it was along the 200-meter contour. Okay? And the Americans got it, and not being metric, and also it turns out the 200-meter contour off the coast of Ecuador looked a lot like the 200-mile zone, and it became 200 miles. I hope that's true. It's such a great story. Anyway, I have many times I've been in meetings in the States where people say we just should not restrict the ability of people to go fishing, and I say, look, the most important thing for you guys was getting rid of the foreign fleet. So we've already decided that not everybody can go fishing. So, but then once you get within a country, then the question is who gets to go fishing. It's still very contentious. Biggest fisheries in the United States are in Alaska. The Alaskans would love to make Alaskan fisheries for Alaskans. But they can't do that because of U.S. law. Every American has the right to fish in any fishery. So most of the fish caught in Alaska are caught from people not from Alaska. And it really pisses the Alaskans off, I guarantee. Okay, so so who can fish? And then when you in many fisheries, there's competing groups. So one of the most common is trawling versus longlining versus purse seining, recreational fishermen, and again, most management agencies do some specific allocation between groups. Then, okay, other big decisions, the assessment process. How do you go from the data to your regulations? and then your regulations, you often set time, area, and catch limits. Okay. Those are all part of the regulatory structure. Big one, funding. How do you fund the management system, and how much do you fund it? So I don't know, does Iceland have cost recovery from the industry? Not directly, okay. New Zealand does. In New Zealand, the cost of the management system is charged to the people who have the quotas for that fishery on a stock-by-stock basis. Australia has some of that. The U.S. typically doesn't. Almost all, our fisheries management system costs a couple $2 billion a year, and it's all paid by taxpayers. Again, we've got some very profitable fisheries. I know individuals who've made, well, I know a couple who've made hundreds of millions of dollars in the fishing business, and I'm still paying to manage their fisheries. Sometimes it's a bit annoying. But how much? I mean, that's a really important management decision. How much research do you do? Because, I mean, I'm sure that all the people who work in this building would argue that we should be doing more research, right? But how do you decide what's the right amount? And it's I can't think of any examples where it's actually done on a rational basis. It's almost always a result of politics and legislatures, etc. Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. Where does the money go as well? So, in New Zealand, every research project is built around a specific stock, and the quota holders for that stock have to pay for it. So they're and they're very skeptical about the scientists want to do study X, Y, or Z. They want to say, okay, how's that going to affect the regulations? But in other cases, like the U.S., if you say you've got a problem that you're a bunch of fishermen on a stock and the government isn't doing a survey, what do you suppose you do if you think a survey would really help you get better manage a stock? What do you suppose you do? Well, that has happened on a few occasions, but in general, you go to the legislature, you go to Congress, and you lobby a congressman to write a line item into the funding bill that says you will do a survey of monkfish off the coast of New England or something. But in some cases, for instance, in Western Canada, the fishing industries there, most of the big ones, with the exception of salmon, they just said, if you guys don't, to the government, you don't do enough research that we can manage this fishery well, particularly when the government, after the collapse of cod in Canada, they became very conservative in their regulations. They didn't have very good data. The industry could see themselves getting squeezed more and more, and so they then actually just said, okay, look, we'll pay for it. Let's do a survey. Let's collect this kind of data. Let's do a tagging program. And I think I saw at one point estimates that the Western Canadian fishing industry was spending $10 million a year funding research because they figured that was in their interest. Anyone know what proportion of the total management budget in Iceland goes into monitoring, compliance, and surveillance? I've heard that in New Zealand it's as much as 30%. I mean, it's a big deal. If you're going to do this well, it's quite expensive. So, for instance, in the United States, we pretty well have a perspective that that every fishery should have 100% observers. So, in the West Coast, all of our boats, probably over 20 meters, would have an observer. And our big boats, over bigger factory trawlers, they have 2 observers, so there's somebody on deck all the time. In other fisheries, we're going increasingly to camera systems, and this is expensive stuff. Human observers are very expensive. I think the costs work out to close to $1,000 a day. Anyway, so you can spend a lot of money. You can spend a lot of money on this, and many countries do. Okay, there's various types of management systems. So probably the most common in the West is some combination of the first 2. Totally top-down, that is, the government runs everything. And I remember being at a meeting, I hate to think, late 1970s, with some groundfish fishermen in the west coast of the U.S. and one of the sort of the top fishermen, and there was a group of scientists and government people, and the guy got up and he said, "My job is to catch as many fish as possible." And then pointing to the audience, he says, "Your job is to keep me from catching too many." Okay? So in his view, that was a government job, okay? Didn't involve any form of, he didn't see that he had a responsibility for understanding how many fish were there, etc. Now, the U.S. is mostly what I would call consultative. The government sets quotas, the government does the science, but there's extensive consultation with industry. And in fact, many of the people who were the ultimate decision makers are from the industry. It's just that they are severely constrained in what decisions they can make by national policy. So, for instance, they can't set quotas higher than science advice. Then there's co-management, where there's some kinds of shared responsibility. And so, say in New Zealand, many of the surveys are now conducted by the fishing industry. And they do it on industry boats. They will typically bring a government or an independent scientist with them on the surveys, but they do the surveys themselves. And then there are some examples of devolved management, where the actual management of the fishery is turned over to the fishing, the people who are doing the fishing. In small coastal fisheries in Chile, they've actually devolved it so far that the fishing cooperatives are given ownership of the coastal fishery and the coastal sea bottom. That's probably the most I know about. Again, in New Zealand, the most devolved fishery there I can think of is the rock lobster fishery, where the data are collected by the fishing industry. The stock assessment is conducted by the fishing industry. But the government's role there is primarily to monitor the data collection process, to monitor the stock assessment process, and then the harvest strategy was developed in consultation with the industry and the government. So, pretty devolved, but also pretty unusual. Let's see. Here's just a table of different roles in different kinds of fisheries management. So setting the goals, setting the harvest strategies, determining data collection, doing assessment, doing access, setting the regulations, doing the enforcement, doing the funding. This is just a table that sort of summarizes the usual state of affairs. That is, when it comes to setting goals, usually scientists have not too much input in there, but managers and users and the public are pretty well always involved. Often happens in the legislative process. Whereas if you get to assessment, it's almost always the scientists who do that, and then users, public and NGOs, may have some input in that process. Whereas enforcement, in general, it's almost always done through the management system, little input from the scientists or sometimes the users. How do you incorporate socio-economic effects? It's usually done through the overall objectives and the access agreement. And this is getting, I'd say, more and more controversial, particularly as ITQ systems have been in place for a long time. Usually ownership is being aggregated. Usually the owners are doing very well. Now, interestingly, say in Alaska, the inshore fisheries, this would be salmon and herring, they prohibit any form of vertical integration. And they prohibit ownership of multiple permits in the same fishery. That they explicitly are maintaining owner-operator fisheries, and they're pretty successful at that. That these small boat fisheries, and their only problem, from the Alaskan perspective, has been they can't restrict access to only Alaskans. So a lot of the Alaskan fishery boat owners live in Seattle, which the Alaskans don't know. Let's see. I want to get on. Let's skip. Okay, so now I want to talk about how are fisheries actually managed. This is a paper we published earlier this year, where we were asked by one of the American foundations to evaluate the management systems in the major fishing countries of the world. And those of you who saw my talk, not yesterday, the day before, my talk Tuesday, Monday. Right. I've lost track of time. Must have been Monday. In the plenary I showed, no, maybe it wasn't. Anyway, there was a published paper on management systems that showed Iceland as having a terrible management system, and many countries in Africa having much more sustainable management system than Iceland or Alaska. And we took a look at that. The original suggestion was, well, can we use that? And I looked at it and said, this is wrong. It just, whatever they did, it didn't work right. So we instituted our own survey. Can't remember. And what we did is we developed a questionnaire that's the one that I put on your shared block, where we collect specific data about specific fisheries. So unlike any of the other surveys that have been done, the one that I criticized by Mora et al., and there's been some others, a paper by Tony Pitcher and a number of others on whether countries are following the FAO Code of Conduct. We did this not country by country, but fishery by fishery within countries, because one of the things that's really obvious is that within any country, there's different levels of management for different fisheries. In general, we believe, we haven't gotten that far in our analysis yet, big fisheries are more intensively managed than small fisheries. So, I know in Iceland, I know in the United States, I know in New Zealand, I know in Australia, that full-blown quantitative assessments are much more likely to be done on large stocks than small stocks. I think New Zealand has TAC set on 640 species area combinations, but there's only 30 quantitative assessments. So the rest of those smaller stocks are being managed on much lower information. Anyway, so our questionnaire had to do with a whole bunch of the nuts and bolts of the specific fishery. And what we're going to do, if time shall serve, is we'll actually work through that questionnaire. Let's go past that. That's the same. So this is a graph I showed. This is just the overall intensity of fisheries management. The color scheme is a little different. And what you see is there are just enormous differences that some of these countries like Myanmar and Cambodia. You know, they have almost no fishery management system. As I said in the talk, you know, Myanmar reports 97% of its catch under marine fish, not otherwise indicated. They have almost nothing. As I said the other day, Brazil has a very sketchy fisheries management system. This is now country by country ranked in terms of their overall score, and we broke it into 5 components: the research, management, enforcement, socioeconomic concerns, and estimates of stock status. And so this is the average score by each of these dimensions. And India is an interesting example because India has a quite sophisticated research system. They have conducted surveys. They have research laboratories, but they have very little ability to enforce regulations. That at least these are. I should say that the way we did this is we tried to identify through networks people who were familiar with the countries, and our objective was to get 5 people to evaluate each country, and then each of the evaluators was given 10 specific stocks to evaluate, and those stocks, each person got the same 4 biggest fisheries in the country, and then they were given a random sample of other fisheries, and we tried to have a balance between the people's role. Were they a government scientist? Were they an academic? Were they a government manager? Were they from the fishing industry? Were they from an NGO? Or were they from what we call outsiders? And in our case, outsiders were almost always ex-FAO employees. And we were expecting there would be pretty big differences between what people's roles were, and there were differences, but they were on the order of 10 or 20%. You know, so the differences between averages were much greater. Anyway, what you typically see is research typically scored the highest, and stock status and enforcement or management tended to score the lowest. Now, as I showed in my plenary talk, this correlates quite closely to perspectives on the stock status. That again, through most of South and Southeast Asia, stock status is assessed to be fairly poor. Nigeria was the only African country, sort of tropical African country, Morocco and South Africa. And I think this slide should, say that an independent study by Anderson et al. has attempted to do something similar, but in this case physically going into specific locations and talking to people and getting expert opinion on stock status. And again, what you see is the places that tended to score low on our survey also have tended to score low when they actually go into the communities. That in general, this FMI is the overall fisheries management index, tends to really be pretty closely related to the per capita income. That clearly rich countries are spending more than poor countries. Has anyone been able to download that spreadsheet? It's not open. Oh, I I don't know what to. Let's go. Let's go. All right. Well, let's do a quick exercise. Does everybody have either a computer or a piece of paper or a phone? What I wanted to just do is run you through this, and let's pick a. What I had intended is for everybody to take a fishery they know. How many people think they know one fishery well? Hopefully from your home country. No? Many of you don't know a fishery well. Oh, that's too bad. Okay. Oh, that's a real disappointment. Come on. You don't know any fishery well? Just very few of you. Very few. Okay, how about Icelanders? I bet some of you must know a fishery well. Okay. So I'm going to let's pick a fishery in Iceland that is not one of the bigger fisheries. Let's take one that is maybe doesn't have a quantitative assessment. What's your name? Okay. No. There's you've got. I was just talking about that at lunch. Monkfish. Lumpfish. Okay. Let's do this for lumpfish. Okay. And what we're going to do is score lumpfish. And well, just for those of you, well, we can let you argue. And the way we score it is either 0, meaning we don't do that. 1, we do that. Or 0.5, yeah, score it. Okay. So here's the. Oops. Okay, come on. Here's the questions. Okay. First question is, do we collect landings data annually and consistently? Yes? Okay, so that gets a 1. Are they collected at the species or stock level, then aggregated across several species? Yes? Is this a single species or it's a single species? Okay. All right. Are the recorded landings thought to be 75% of total landings? In other words, is there a lot of illegal or unreported catch? No. Okay, so that gets a 1. You're doing well on this so far. Body size data are collected consistently. Yes? Okay. Age data are collected, but not aged, okay? Is it because they can't be or just too expensive? Just hasn't been done, okay. And the size or age data at the species or stock level, that's because that's going to be 1, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, are there fishery independent surveys? No. So what does 0.5 mean in this case? I mean, okay, that's the question. I mean, that's the question. Does it reflect abundance? So okay. Yeah, okay. So, but it is assumed it's used in the assessment. So you don't have a CPUE, but you don't use that? So it's okay. So you do have a CPUE series, all right, all right. They're collected at the species level again. Is there an assessment? The answer is yes, right? Okay. Assessments are performed frequently enough. How often do you do it? Every year, every 2 years? Okay. You're going to get a good score on this one, I think. In the assessment, population models are used. So how does this? So what? Sorry. It's not a population model. Okay. So there, you don't estimate traditional reference points then? You just have a historical reference point? Okay. Yeah. Okay. But the assessment results are used to provide advice, though, right? Well, it's an empirical assessment. Yeah. Okay. No, I think, but that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. Let's see what this is. Stock size. No, it's not. So you don't estimate that. For stocks with reliable estimates, stock size is thought to be at or above the range that provides maximum sustainable yield. So basically your rule is if your index is below a certain level, then what happens? You lower catch. The advice on the quota. Okay. 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 So so this is really, where is that index right now? Yeah. Okay, I'll give you a 1 on that then. Stock size is increasing, right? Okay. Fishing mortality rate is thought to be acceptable then? Okay, all right. Is fishing mortality rate decreasing? Okay, let's do that as a 0.5. Okay. Management objectives are explicitly stated or well understood? No? Okay. Fisheries management plans exist, so you do have a management plan, right? Okay. They're specific to the species? Yes. A target level or range of abundance or fishing mortality rates are specified? And you actually have a harvest control rule then, effectively, right? Yeah. Okay. Regulations are sufficient for actually achieving acceptable levels? 0.5? Okay. Fishing pressure is reduced when stock status is more uncertain. You don't really have any measure of uncertainty in there, right? Okay. Regulations to limit fishing pressure have been adjusted in the past. So you have changed catches, right? Yeah. Okay. So the decisions are based on estimates of stock status? That's yes. Management process uses some form of a harvest control rule. So, yeah, I'd have to say that's a harvest control rule of some kind. Right? I mean, TAC is proportional to the index. That's a harvest control rule. How are we doing? Let's just quick through. So dockside monitoring and enforcement measures. So you have dockside monitoring, right? Yeah. At-sea observers and enforcement measures are sufficient to effectively regulate the fishing pressure. Yeah, but oh, all right. Okay. So penalties or disincentives are thought to be sufficient to ensure compliance with regulations? When there's ways they can not comply with the quota? Oh, because it's effort. All right, well, let's give that a 0 then, just to keep things interesting. Illegal or unreported catches are thought to be low enough the fisheries management system can effectively regulate fishing pressure. Okay. Potential sensitive habitats have been identified. Not too worried about that. Okay. I'll give you one. Regulations are in place to prevent or reduce negative fishing impacts in those locations. Well, actually, this should really be an NA then. Enforcement, okay, these are all NAs. Juveniles, is there concern about juveniles? Okay, well, then that'd be an NA as well. Yeah. Now, we said in place to reduce bycatch, and you say bycatch is a concern. Is that right? So that's a 0 then, right? Discard mortality or bycatch limits exist. Are there any limits on that? No. Yeah. Okay. Annual records for the number of boats. Yeah. Okay. Limited entry on number of boats. Yes. Licenses or individual code confirm some degree of transferable property right. Is this in the ITQ system? Okay. What? Opportunities for user groups to provide input into the management decision process? No, okay. Cooperatives or harvesters associations induce collective action in the management process? A half, okay. Management decisions and the reason are transparent, that is, they're publicly disclosed? Okay. No significant government subsidies? So okay, so you get a 1. No significant, no, okay, no. Okay, so that's more or less how that survey worked, and we asked each person to do 10 stocks, although they could say, look, I don't know enough about this stock. And as far as I know, that's the most thorough. We now have data for 500 country species combinations, and what we're aiming to get is 1,000. So we want to do the 500 largest fisheries in the world, and then another 500 essentially randomly sampled, so we can talk about how fisheries are managed. And what we're in the process of doing is looking at the correlation between how they score on this management index and the performance. But the problem is that, well, there's a very high correlation, as you saw, country by country. The countries that have a high management index also tend to rate the status of their stocks higher. We haven't yet done the comparison for the stocks that we have stock assessments for, but I am pretty sure that we will find that correlation, because we have stock assessments for about 60 for the Mediterranean Sea, and the average stock status there is very poor, and they have almost no fisheries management. So I know we're going to get a cluster of points with no fisheries management, poor status. We'll see. Anyway, that's all I had on fisheries management. Maybe I'll take any questions or. In all cases, they were not on our list of countries to do. with the exception of Morocco, Nigeria, and South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, South Africa has a pretty well defined fisheries there, established. And I'm just curious about, I mean, the whole East Coast of Africa is just.
Well, it's because none of them were among the 28 biggest fishing countries in the world. That was Nigeria, Morocco, and South Africa were the ones that fell in that. We're actually doing some now to try, some of them, but I mean that's let's go. Just marine fish. Yes, just marine fish. Oh no, it's not in this graph. If you remember this morning's graph, the marine catch of African fisheries outside of Morocco, Nigeria, and South Africa is just very small, very small. We recently did a workshop in our trawl project on African trawling fisheries, and it was one of the things we did is collected data on the intensity of trawling in many of the African countries, and certainly domestic trawling, not foreign trawling, is really very low pressure, confined mostly to a few shrimp fisheries. Certainly in East Africa, the big exceptions were Morocco and Tunisia. In their Mediterranean fisheries are really intense trawl fisheries, but the intensity of trawling in the other countries was surprisingly low.
On the other hand, the European fisheries, the European Union is negotiating for the fleets, for the territories, and there is a big question now being undertaken by the markets for those countries without pretty much in this business with the European Union. Is trying to strengthen the capacity of people there to virtually be able to negotiate on the stocks and realize the potential of the stocks and the value of the value.
Yeah. Right. Well, in Mozambique. And there's FAO has done some assessments of Northwest Africa, and in general, the demersal stocks are in quite poor shape. The pelagics are in better shape. But the Nansen program has done surveys through both East and West Africa, and those of you who are from those countries, it's very good data. But it's never been put together and used, and I'd say a very high priority for those countries is to really start using that data. I'm in discussion, but we're actually doing a proposal with the Nansen program in Norway to start running some training courses with some of the specific countries and on how to use the Nansen data to assess the status of their resources. And there's also similar data for most of Asia. There are something like 10,000 trawl survey data points for South and Southeast Asia that have never been used in any assessment. And it's just this valuable data that's sitting there. The Norwegians can't do anything with it without collaboration with the the data belongs to the countries, and so what we need to do is get people in those countries to start using that data in collaboration with people who can help them actually do the assessment. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, when we started doing this, there was a lot of concern that, well, people aren't going to want to admit that their countries aren't doing well. But we didn't find that was the case. That we found that the Brazilian scientists and the Brazilian managers, said, yeah, we don't do it first because these aren't opinions saying, well, do we do a good job or do a bad job? It's, do you do this? So it's largely fact-based, but also that the Brazilians, for instance, or any of these other countries, they want their countries to do better, and they basically, this is a tool for them to go to their governments and say, look, you're not doing this. This is the, when things like COFI and FAO, FAO can't do this. Okay, FAO cannot present data that the government didn't supply officially. Governments would never do this. But at the side sessions at COFI, the people can say, look, Brazil, you're just not doing a very good job, and because you've got to get the political will. One of your allies in doing this as scientists is typically your fishing industry. There is this conception that fishing industries are rapers and pillagers, and the good guys are the environmental NGOs. Okay, but if you look at where the money goes and where it comes from, if the people who benefit the most by sustaining fisheries is the fishing companies. That these companies that have invested millions of dollars in an Icelandic company that spends $50 million for a new boat, it's really depending upon that fishery being sustainable. And certainly in countries like the U.S., the NGOs benefit by fisheries doing badly. And so they always want to emphasize that things are terrible because that's how they raise money. They don't want, it's not in their financial interest for fisheries to be doing well, because certainly in the U.S., if our fisheries had not been overfished in the 1990s, the hundreds of millions of dollars a year that's being spent by foundations to NGOs wouldn't be there. So the financial incentives, if you would say, well, who should we believe? Should we believe scientists or should we believe the NGOs? The public believes the NGOs are more honest, but they've got very different motives.
Many stocks which are being fished with no assessment. But then in addition to that, you mentioned maybe half of fish stocks in the ocean are being used.
Well, probably less.
Probably less.
I mean, just by species, it would be much less.
My question is, knowing the history of this institute, we were like a fish finding institute.
Yeah.
In the 70s and 80s, 60s, and now we are trying to organize it and be part of a larger organization system. Why aren't the fish species
I think it's hard. I think economically they're not profitable to catch. As I mentioned, mesopelagics. There's now some of the estimates of mesopelagic abundance are gigantic, and sustainable yield estimates on the order of 100 million tons. But nobody can figure out how to catch them at a way that is economically viable at all. But there's the balanced harvesting idea that comes out of a number of ecosystem modeling people saying, look, we could increase fish yields a lot if we would, instead of, as we do now, mostly harvesting high trophic level, if we were to balance our harvesting across trophic levels. If you look at the ratio of the fishing mortality rate to the natural mortality, right? So natural mortality rate is how much is going to other species in the ecosystem. For trophic level 3, it's on the order of 20 to 1. That is, the natural mortality rate is much, much higher than the fishing mortality rate. It's only when you get to about 4.5 that fishing mortality starts to be significant compared to natural mortality. So we could, in theory, catch a lot more fish by fishing lower down in the food chain. But it's still primarily markets. Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the fishery itself. I mean, some fisheries, the sedentary species, can usually be managed quite well on a small scale community basis, using very simple rules. So in many cases, we're talking like sedentary invertebrates. You can the very common problem is that they're being harvested much too small. And just a simple change in size of harvest can dramatically increase yields, and those things could be done at the community level, and there's a lot of effort going into that in various countries of very low information assessment. Basically just figuring out what the size of maturity of this species is and getting the community to agree to not harvest the little ones. But many developing countries have essentially significant industrial fisheries where you're very unlikely to ever be able to try to manage fisheries like Iceland or the United States or Canada or New Zealand does with quotas. Just too hard to measure the catch, but you can in those cases, the first thing is just understanding where the stock is with respect to is it really depleted or is it in pretty good shape? If it is depleted, and you can often do that with very little information. Size, trends in CPUE will often tell you that. Basically, the survey we did and the work that the Andersons have done, you go into a place, people know whether their fisheries are doing well compared to the past or not. Anyone who's been there for 10 years can usually tell you that. And then the question is, and the hard question, is how do you reduce fishing pressure? And in some cases, it can be done by changes in gear. Sometimes there's very unselective fishing gears, but at that point, it really becomes culturally country dependent. So, are you from India? No. Bangladesh. Okay. Well, I know in India, the government has very little success at enforcing regulations, but the fishing cooperatives, the fishermen's, I don't know if they're called unions, but they have very strong self-enforcement, and they just need, say you're dealing with a mesh size, they just need to be convinced that they will be benefited by a larger mesh size, and they'll make it happen. So I think each country has different ways that, that regulations can be instituted, but they almost always are going to involve the fishing groups, and whether it's at the community scale or the industry scale, really believing it's in their interest to do it.
Patterns and fisheries, patterns also for that goes. Depends the volume of that, and then we meet with the